I look after all the incoming and outgoing exchange students at Warwick Business School for the master's level. So interestingly, I actually got a new job while I was pregnant, but then because my little boy was born so early, I never actually got to do the new job before I went on maternity leave. So then when I came back off maternity leave in the middle of a pandemic, I went into a new job. He was born at 25 weeks. So he was born considered as a micro premature baby. So he was £1 15 ounces when he was born. So he's, I think, like what you see, like he's one of those super teeny tiny babies that you can just fit in your hand. And then actually very much connected to the idea of feeding, he contracted something called NEC, NEC, which is a condition where it meant that he got a really severe infection in his intestines that actually meant that he ended up with 9 perforations, and basically meant that he then had to have life-saving surgery at 9 days old. So at 9 days old, weighing, a little less under 2 pounds, he had to have an operation where he had a third of his bowel removed, and then he had a stoma formed. So obviously everything came out into like the little bags. Obviously those bags are massive when you're this small because they only make them so small. So he had that for 15 weeks. And at that whole point, he was able to have, when he got up to it, he was able to have 5 mils of milk every 2 hours, and that was it. So basically his whole digestive system had to be completely rested for all of that time, really. He had the 5 mils just to keep it ticking over. And then he had that reversed, so all sewn back all up together again and all back inside before he was able to come home. And he came home, actually on his due date. For me, the expressing was like a 2-part, because obviously a lot of the other mums that were in the NICU with me that were expressing, not that there were many, they were obviously expressing because they had to keep up with the demand of the baby. So even though it was the baby was being tube fed, which Jacob obviously was as well, but to a much lesser extent, they were having to keep up with demand of what the baby was actually taking. And, the baby was having milk, every 2 hours, and it was quite substantial amounts. And, there was that need, so they were using up what they were pumping. And obviously they did have often they had a bit of excess. But for me, obviously, 1 pump would equal more than he would have in the whole 24 hours. So for me, I was doing it on twofold. One, in case we weren't able to actually get him to latch and things, and then I'd have a bit of, have a couple of months worth of milk that he could have when he was able to feed orally, but also just to keep my milk up to hopefully get him to latch, which obviously he then did. He just had his reversal, so he'd just come through another set of surgery, and that was the first time then. It was only a few days after his surgery we then moved out of the high intensity, so we were in maximum like the ICU, so the intensive care. We were in that for the whole time because he was, if your nutrition is provided through your veins, and you have to be in the intensive area. So we'd only just moved out. So every day, actually, I was there from like 8 till 8 every day to meet the sort of doctors in the morning as they came onto shift, and also to do the night shift, like to check who the staff were in the night shift. But in that morning, they came around and did the morning doctors round. So all the doctors that are looking after all the babies come around. So you always have like sort of maybe 5 or 6 doctors come to your baby every day and talk about the plan for the day. So what's the objectives? And so obviously you didn't really know what was going to be said at that point. And often you could sort of say, well, it was just the same as yesterday, just continuing with feeds. Yes, generally doing okay, monitoring this, checking that, it was the general stuff. But then that day there was, the doctor was like, oh, and how is he doing with his feeds? Yeah, they're going all right. It's like, oh, I think we could probably look at, the mother breastfeeding, because obviously they knew that I was expressing, because I actually chose to express next to him. So I hired my own pump so I could express next to him rather than having to go off to the room separate and express there. So I basically was always there. The doctors, whenever they were around, constantly expressing. So they definitely, and obviously we've been there for 15 weeks, so they definitely get to know you. So they all knew I was definitely expressing. And then they said, so you can have a go later on today. And it was just like, what? Today? I felt so unprepared. It was so, I guess I hadn't really thought about it. I've been so prepared. Like I was pretty expert by that point. I was pretty experienced at expressing. But then I was like, I don't know how to do it. What do I do? Like, how would I possibly do this? Like, so that's the other thing. I think you there's so much when you pick up a baby that's in NICU, they're nearly always attached to machinery and they've got lots of different wires and things. So you're constantly faffing with all of those as well as a baby and everything else. So yeah, and just, you're sat on hospital chairs and it's really uncomfortable and you don't have pillows and stuff. You don't have anything that you can use to prop up, and because it's all sort of a sterile environment. So suddenly you're just sort of like, well, the idea of like, oh, well, get yourself comfortable, lean back a bit, put some pillows on, like none of that happens. So you're then trying to feed a bit, like do all of those things. You're not in a bed or anything. You're just sort of sat on a plastic chair, like suddenly being like, all right, I've got my baby, but what do I do now? And it was, yeah, a huge fumble, and not obviously it was amazing to do, but it wasn't like this amazing euphoric experience of like, oh, yes. But while he was in NICU, he did actually have a dummy, because I often put a dummy in while I was giving him his tube feed, just to connect the two things. Not that I ever made him full, because it was 5 mils, but to connect the two things together. We sort of didn't have a problem. We didn't think there was going to be a problem with that, in that we knew he had the sucking sort of reflex, of which he did straight away. Like that was not a problem. So actually from the beginning, so as soon as I started latching him, he definitely knew what to do. Like it was instant. Like he definitely knew that that's what he wanted to do. To learn to swallow, suck, and breathe. Because even at that point, he hadn't that long been off breathing apparatus either. So actually just breathing on your own was quite a big thing for him, let alone all these other things as well. So yeah, and then actually I was really lucky, because not all hospitals have the ability, but I was able to room in for 2 weeks. So then I was able to live at the hospital for the 2 weeks, so that I was able to do like all of his, like whenever it was ready, whenever he needed a feed, I could do them. I could, be there for him to do that. So overnight as well. So he was born at Coventry, and we were there until he needed his surgery, and then we had to move to Leicester because they're the surgical experts. And actually, because he then was classed as a surgical baby, we wouldn't have been allowed home, ironically, until he was able to breastfeed, and then we could have gone back to Coventry, but we would have only been there for 2 weeks. So given that they knew us and we'd been there for a long time and we got routine and all of that, we just stayed at Leicester for those final 2 weeks. On one hand, there's the idea that that the hospital definitely want you to express, because obviously it is better. Like it is better for these tiny premature babies. The formula, like actually formula actually, if a premature baby is given formula, they're much more likely to get the infection that Jacob had. So in that sense, obviously the hospitals want you to express, because they want you to have, they want the babies to have breast milk. But yet at the same time, because so few mums actually take that up or continue with it or do it, the facilities that are there are awful. And it's like, they're just, from my 2 experience, I mean, Coventry more arguably marginally better, but the whole experience of doing it is just awful. It's just, yeah, I mean, one of the really practical things with that I found really difficult, and one of the reasons why I chose to express by him, was that you're the first thing, you have to leave your baby. So you're in the hospital and you want to be with your baby, but regularly every few hours you're expected or required to leave and go down to a little corridor, down through to a little horrible room with a curtain and a plastic chair, and sit on a horrible, like you used to have it like school halls, like this plastic chair and express in a room that's got no windows and is dark, and it's just a bit grubby, and it just doesn't have that night, like it's just a horrible experience. And for me, the thing that I really hated about it was that you had to like buzz through, because obviously it's high security, you have to like buzz through like 5 or 6 doors. So what would take you 2 minutes to go and get your expressing kit from the sterilizer, and that smell, you have to go and get your expressing kit, then you have to buzz back through to get back through to the other door, to go back into the expressing room, to then use it, to then have to go back through. It was just so horrible, and you'd spend ages just waiting the wrong side of a door just to get through to like deal with your milk. And then I had to obviously leave it on the side, which obviously I brought up in my piece. You just sort of had to like, I've got this milk, and they're like, oh yeah, just leave it on the side. You're like, I don't know you. It feels kind of like a really personal act. It feels like something really important. I don't know if you're going to put it in the freezer in time. I don't know like who you are, but yeah, here you are. Here's my baby's milk. Just do what you like with it. Just completely lost its feeling of like, yeah, being something kind of special and a bond between me and Jacob. That definitely wasn't how it felt. Not until I directly breastfed. To begin with, still, like in those first 2 weeks, the whole reason why we were in hospital is he was sort of ready to go home, apart from that, we needed to be able to make sure that he could feed. So then there was like a real pressure of like, right, we've got, like, the longer it takes us to get this established, the longer we have to be in hospital for. And all we wanted to do was go home. You're really exhausted by that point. I just knew I was going to breastfeed. And oh my goodness, those like that first like couple of hours of like trying to collect the colostrum, like by squeezing your nipples, like I've got no idea what I'm doing, and this is so hard, and like you're literally happy with like 0.3 of a mil. Yeah, we got the choice of, so when we were, obviously when we knew we needed sort of we knew we were always going to need sort of a NICU. We knew we were always going to be going into a NICU. Then obviously we were given there's the different levels, obviously Coventry, Nuneaton and Warwick, and for rugby we could go to any of them, but Coventry were the only ones that could, actually they're the ones we picked, but they were also the only ones that had the higher level. And then when we needed a level above that, then that's when we needed to go to Leicester. But we could have ended up anywhere. It just happens that we were still pretty local. I was really lucky. Like, one of my absolute best friends now it was a breastfeeding peer supporter who was also breastfeeding her NICU baby, and we've become really close, and we were like, basically our stories followed, so we ended up in the same room a couple of weeks behind each other. So she'd already moved into the room, and then like 2 weeks later I was like, hello, I'm here, we're back reunited. And she was really supportive and gave loads of help, loads of advice, gave me like places to look for like reputable advice and all of that, because the nurses were just like, oh, I'll put the screens around you. I'm like, no, I don't want to have the screens around me. I don't want to be like segregated from everyone else, not be able to see out and be enclosed. And also, if I need your help, I need to be able to like get your help. And then just like learning how to do it, they were just sort of like, very forceful, but not, I don't know, not in a good way, I didn't think. But it took us, yeah, it was, oh my goodness, it was so painful. And it transpired that Jacob had a tongue tie, but you can only have a tongue tie corrected, snip, within the first 12 weeks of life, which of course, by the time we were breastfeeding, he was already 15 weeks old. So we couldn't actually have it dealt with. So just had to feed through a tongue tie and a tiny baby and way too much supply. Cost of all the treatment that Jacob, I mean, obviously Jacob didn't get it through formula, but the cost of like all of that treatment, if you were more supportive and encouraging and like had a nice environment for the breastfeeding mother, then you probably would have less babies that sick that then needed to stay in hospital with all those resources. I mean, it was costing, I mean, obviously the cost of Jacob being in hospital, we would never be able to think about the cost of that. Like, it's literally thousands of pounds every single day for him to be in hospital. And he was there for 105 days. Like, the amount of money that cost was crazy. So we're really grateful to the NHS. But we probably wouldn't have been there as long and saved some of that money if we'd have had better support, and we could have got out quicker because breastfeeding would have been better. And it's funny, isn't it, how they're all connected? But they did have knowledge about expressing, and they did have knowledge about breastfeeding, but they had absolutely no knowledge of how to go from one to the other, because they didn't have very many mums go from one to the other. So they had a small number of people that expressed, but then gave up before their baby was actually big enough to feed. So they, in the end, they ended moving on to, using up bottle feeds, using up the milk they'd got, and then formula feeding. That was one route. Or the babies would be small but able to directly breastfeed immediately, and they'd have good support on that. They'd have very few mums that were able to keep up expressing for that long within that environment and with that stress level, and keep their milk enough to be able to transition from one to the other. That was an even tinier proportion of people that started expressing. So they had like no knowledge of how to go from one to the other. Expressing is like, it's time consuming in some ways, and it's just like, it's a lot of work, isn't it? And it's like constant, like, but very regular, like very sort of, it's not like, oh, I can just pick up my baby and fit it around to other things. And it's not like that, especially with like in that situation, you're traveling back and forth to hospital and you're exhausted and you're like generally stressed, and you're trying to fit in all of your life in like an hour when you get home before you're shattered and need to go to bed. And like, I think just doing it, I think just physically doing the expressing that regularly to keep your supply up for that long, while your baby is having numerous operations or procedures, or there's always setbacks in NICU. There's no baby that goes into NICU and like has no setbacks at all, even if it's like a little blip. You're on the edge all the time. And basically, if your baby's in NICU, I don't know if it's for everyone, but fundamentally there's a real sense of I could lose my baby at any point. Like at any point I could just, you're waiting to go home, but you just don't know that's a guarantee. For me, I'd already had a little girl before Jacob who we didn't get to bring home from hospital. So it was a very real experience for me that I might not have him. So you're living with that every single day. So trying to like go, oh, just relax and express and keep it going in that experience. And also away from your child, obviously, because you're having to express at home, away from your baby and all of that. I think it's just hard for women to be expected, like to actually be able to do that and have the mindset and the resilience to do it is quite hard. I think they also definitely like Leicester, they definitely suffered from the don't force me to breastfeed. So then they didn't say anything. But then it was difficult because those people that actually needed the support and did want to breastfeed were caught in that loop of like the people that felt very defensive. I mean, so we still breastfeed, like, which is great, like, which is amazing. Like, so he's nearly 2, we're still breastfeeding. Because they had no guidance on it. Like, so obviously you've got really big supply, but I've got a tiny baby who only wants a really small amount of milk. They were like, well, you can't express because you'll just make it worse. You'll just like give yourself more milk. I'm like, yeah, but my boobs are so full right now. He actually can't latch because they're like, so me and my friend used to have to pretend to be like, I'm just popping to the loo. But yeah, we got there. We definitely got there and had a really good health visitor actually. She was really, really, really helpful. Not necessarily knowledgeable about breastfeeding, but just really supportive of it. And it was tricky because we were on twice weekly weigh-ins. So there was a real pressure on my ability to feed him successfully because obviously twice a week he was getting weighed to check he was putting on weight and like every gram counted. And so like for the first 3 weeks he didn't go up more than like 10 grams every time we got weighed, which like just wasn't enough. And so there was this real pressure of like, and this real threat of formula when we finally got to, or at least a bottle, which I also didn't want, very strongly didn't want those. So there was real pressure on me, and I really felt that in those early weeks because I was having a health professional like tell me whether I was successful enough or not, which you don't really get in the same sense. I don't think if you have like a full-term baby, they obviously get weighed, but you get a bit longer to see. But the reason why like my health visitor was really good because she was like, right, I've obviously got 20 minutes, so just feed him now and I'll just weigh him right at the end. There was a real pressure because we had to go back to the hospital as well and get reported, and it was because I had to ring up with his weights twice a week, so the health visitor would do it and then I'd have to ring and go, this is his weight this week, and they'd be like, yes, that's fine, you can keep going, or we'll need to reassess and talk to the nutritionist. And yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how we made it really. Well, I do know how we made it. We made it because of my friend who also had an NICU baby, who was ridiculously amazing and incredibly supportive and knowledgeable and kind and patient, and yeah, a great support. And my husband was really good as well, obviously. I think I would have still done it, but I think it would have felt so much harder to do it without my friend because, we were in a different situation and people just didn't like, even when we went to sort of the breastfeeding support group, they had general knowledge, but they didn't have like maybe the experience of my situation, which I think was quite unusual. And they just, they were sort of reeling out the standard lines. I'm like, oh, let me tell you, I've watched many a YouTube video, like, yeah, I know all of this, but that's not what's happening. Like, it's not the same. Yeah. I think the society aspect, I guess I just didn't really know about it. I just didn't expect to like have so much negativity around it. Like, I just didn't think that would happen. I think I was sort of let off because Jacob was premature, and like, so there was like some kind of acceptance of it. So there's that understanding that I think in some ways that there is reasons why breastfeeding is considered the first choice, should be from a medical perspective considered the first choice. But I just wasn't expecting to face any negativity or any sort of bite back from breastfeeding my child. Like, I just didn't expect to see it, but yeah, we did. Like, not a lot, but enough here and there. Or why don't you give them something solid, like start solids earlier because that'll help them sleep better, and like all of those things, like the misunderstanding really. Like, and it was the same for me. Like, I've done so much research now, I feel like I definitely know more, but misunderstanding of like what actually helps a child, and what breastfeeding actually is, and what breast milk has and what it does, and all those other things, like even all sorts of all sorts of things. And I know I've been guilty of it too, with when you don't know stuff, you're like, well, surely that can't be the case. Obviously, there's been moments where I'm like, I don't think I can do this any longer. But then it's so good to find that person who you can talk about those challenges freely without knowing that their response is not going to be formula. Their response is going to be, try this, have a go at this. And it's not like, why, it's, or just being a place to go, yeah, that's really hard. But actually finding that person that you can have that conversation with, I think they're quite rare. My husband was amazing. Like, he was really good. And he's been really, like, little things, like for me, like he did all of the washing up of all of the expressing kit, like every night, and did all of that, and was so supportive of the whole thing, and still is, like, unbelievably supportive, even though, like, he knew even less than I did. And has, like, obviously he'd never come across breastfeeding before, and hadn't, like, that was completely new to him. But yeah, he's been really supportive and is amazing. So my little boy's nearly 2, but we were actually basically in an unofficial lockdown for all of that time. So I actually went into hospital in May 2019, and we've basically been in lockdown since then, because so I was in hospital in a room by myself for a month. That is because I was on a tilted upside down bed for a month, where I wasn't able to get out of bed for anything at all, in the hope to try and literally gravity keep him in. So because I was tilted upside down, he literally couldn't be born because I was upside down. So that was an interesting 5 weeks for me as well, because obviously you're literally, the idea of people when they say, like, oh, cross your legs to keep them in, I was like, no, I literally was upside down, not moving, and wasn't allowed to, like, lift my head off a pillow or anything, or do anything for those 5 weeks to make sure that he stayed in as long as possible. But then ironically, he was actually born via emergency C-section in the end. So I was in hospital in a room by myself for over a month, and then we had to be away from everybody while he was in hospital. So he was in hospital for 4 months after he was born. So we didn't see anybody, and we couldn't risk getting even a common cold at that point, because it meant we wouldn't have been able to go and see him. So we basically went into lockdown, not that we knew that's what it was called, but we just basically became hermits at that point. So from June, and then we said we were going to sort of meet people and see people from March 2009. 2020, we were going to go and see people, and, like, flu season was over, and he was a bit more robust, and he got a bit more of an immune system because he had a compromised immune system. So yeah, we were sort of going to go out and do stuff, and then of course that didn't happen. So we've never really done much. We've not really seen anyone or gone to any shops or done anything like that, really. We did a little bit of it in the new year when he was a bit bigger, but yeah, so we've not really, it's sort of normal for us now. We've done it for such a long time now. Timing wise meant it's just, felt like it's been an extension of it. And even, like, the normality of, like, having to anti-back your hands and that sort of thing, that was normal life for us. And actually it had been a sort of, in some cases, it'd been a bit of a battle to sort of have other people, if they were coming over, to sort of have that mindset, because it just wasn't normal. But for us, it was normal. And then now we're like, why did we not make people wear masks? That's clearly what we should have been doing. But that would have, obviously, for socially, that would have been a step too far, but not now. It's been, actually, in some ways, it's been really good for him to have that year to, like, grow up and not have to go back into hospital like he had previously, and just be able to sort of, get bigger and get stronger without the risk of getting stuff. Yeah, it's been really helpful. I think for me, because of the pandemic, I've had no space to really process much of the experience of, well, all of NICU, really. And I know there's a lot of trauma built up in that, and that's something I'm going to have to deal with. But I think what was really good for me is that I had, like, a specific area that actually was very positive overall. The fact that we're still breastfeeding, I'm so proud of it. Funny enough, only this month, I've actually, through a friend of a friend, have been put in touch with someone who's just had a 26-week baby, who wants to express, and talking her through about some of the reasons and how to do it, and some hints and tips and general experience of NICU as well. So yeah, and that's been amazing. I've really enjoyed that. It's been really good. Me and my friend talk about this all the time. Like, we're thinking, like, how could NICU have been any worse? And then it's crazy to think now, oh yeah, actually it could have been worse. Like, but at the time, there was no way we could have expected it to be any worse. I cannot believe what families have been going through the NICU experience like we did, but in a pandemic as well. I cannot but understand how they're coping at all.